classic, Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity is a book that C.S. Lewis did a series on the radio on BBC. And he did these over several days. And they took the transcript of it, and he took the transcript and he just turned it into a book. So he just kind of changed the language a little bit to make it more like a prose rather than like a speaking style. And he, about a third of his book, Mere Christianity, is fleshing out the moral argument. Now, the moral argument goes basically like this. We did our logic earlier in the class, and so the logic goes like this, that number one, every law has a lawgiver. Number two, there is an objective moral law. And then it logically flows that therefore there is a moral, objective moral lawgiver. An objective moral lawgiver. What we are going to do today is examine this here and ask, are these premises true? Premise number one, just like in the cosmological argument, the argument from beginning, where we say everything that began had a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That is rock solid logic. There's nothing wrong with that logic. And the fact that everything that has a beginning has a cause is self-evident. You don't have to prove that. You just know that. That the universe had a beginning is what we then went on to show that all of the evidence of science that we have today shows that the universe had a beginning. And once we solidly conclude that the universe had a beginning, then we know that the universe had a cause. Okay, and we looked at those different causes, natural causes versus supernatural causes, and we would have to realize that if you're going to believe in a natural cause of somethingness coming from nothingness, you have to suspend an awful lot of intelligence and logic and have blind faith that naturally you could get something from nothing. It's quite absurd, actually. The same is true here for the moral argument. Every law has a lawgiver. That is self-evident. If there is a law, there is somebody that has brought that law into being. The question is, there is an objective moral law, and that is what we're going to explore today. And I think that we're up and running here, so we're going to try this one more time.
Has anybody seen Risen yet?
Yeah.
Did you like it?
Yeah.
How's it ranked, like with War Room and The Guy's Not Dead and not as high?
Very violent.
Well, Rogan.
Right.
It's definitely a lot unscripted.
Right. Yeah, it's through the eyes of the guy who's searching for.
So they put a Roman in a different.
Okay, so this is what we're going to do here. Three great arguments for a theistic God. We have covered the cosmological argument, the argument from beginning. We spent the last several weeks looking at the teleologic argument, which is the argument from design, that there is design in the universe and that there is design in life. And now we're going to go to the moral argument. The argument from the beginning and the argument from design is a very science-based exploration. However, the moral argument is more of a philosophical exploration. So here's our moral argument. The moral argument, as we just reviewed here, is one, every law has a lawgiver. There is an objective moral law, and therefore there is an objective moral lawgiver. Now, there is a sense of right and wrong that is pervasive throughout all of humanity. Even if we speak to somebody that doesn't believe that there is a God, there is common agreement that right and wrong exists. I think if you sat down with people who did not believe in God and you started to try to find some common ground, it would be easy to get to things like it is wrong to torture children. And you might agree that it's wrong to murder innocent people. And we might also agree that it's wrong to commit rape. And most people have a sense that it's good to help people, that it's right to stay faithful to your spouse, and that it's good to be committed to raising your children. There seems to be some kind of prescriptive law, a prescription that is written on the hearts of humanity, this kind of prescription to do what's good or to do what's right. And the question is, where does this come from? Some people may call that your conscience. Or you may call it natural law. Our founding fathers called it nature's law. And what I'm going to call it for this discussion is the moral law. The founding fathers believed in the moral law. They called it nature's law. And this is what they said. They said in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a good illustration because when you look at this, the founders held these truths to be self-evident. They did not make a argument, a philosophical argument that said, hey, these rights exist. What they said was, this isn't up for discussion. We're just going to tell you that it is self-evident. What they were saying is, we know this because these are things that are very basic, that are written on the hearts of humanity, and we're not going to argue whether it's true or not. We're just going to tell you that it is self-evident that all men are created equal. This is something written on the hearts of man that we all know to be true. And that they are endowed by their Creator, that it is God outside of ourselves that have given us these inalienable rights, these rights that cannot be taken away, that it's just something given by God, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They leave it open that there are others, but they mention three. And what's important here, and what I wanted to point out, is that the founders believed in a moral law. They called it nature's law, and that they felt that these things were not up for discussion, that these things were self-evident. Okay? When we talk about every law has a lawgiver, that is self-evident. I don't have to prove that. That's just something, it's like 2 + 2 = 4. It's self-evident. And so the founders believed in this moral law. They believed in nature's law, and they used it as a justification. That was their source of rightness and justness in separating themselves from the rule of King George. Okay? So, the moral law, what we're asking ourselves is there a moral law? And if the answer is yes, then the logic here is valid, and there is a moral lawgiver. So, what is the evidence for moral law? Well, if we were to kind of distill it down, the moral law is that there are basic principles of right and wrong that everyone knows, whether they admit them or not. Now, as I said, the founders felt it was self-evident, and they don't use reason to discover it. They just said, you just know it. We would call that that document, we'd call it a particularist document. particulars just refers to the fact that I'm not going to justify it. I'm going to assert it to be true. And it needs to be something that is self-evident. And I want to point out that people who will deny God, as we said in the beginning, still know it. They still know this to be true. They still agree that it's bad to torture children. But the problem is they don't know why. They can't have a basis for that morality if there's nothing outside of themselves that says that that's what's right to do. So they know it, but they simply don't know why. And I want to point out that if there is no objective standard of meaning and morality, then that means that life is meaningless and nothing, and there's nothing that we can do that's absolutely right or absolutely wrong. It is then merely a matter of opinion. Now, all people are impressed with a sense of right and wrong. We all have it. And we all imagine and know that virtue is better than vice, that love is superior to hatred, that courage is superior to cowardice. And C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, he illustrates it this way. He says, just think of a country, okay, addressing relativists who would say, well, in one country they do one thing and in another country they do a different thing. So just think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all of the people who had been the most kind to him. And as you try to imagine that, you might just as well imagine a country where 2 + 2 = 5. What he's saying is, it's simply absurd. In other words, everyone knows that there are absolute moral obligations, something that is binding on all persons at all times and in all places. It doesn't mean that we know all the nuances of what's right and wrong. We can have disagreements about what's morally right. And it recognizes, it doesn't mean that we all recognize what is right in all situations. And that there's definitely problems that occur when people deny the moral law and they go off and do things that are immoral. But it does mean that there are basic principles of right and wrong that everyone knows whether they'll admit them or not. All right? So there are certain things that we simply cannot not know. Okay? We can boil this down and say there are certain things that we cannot not know. Okay? Such as
Double negative, yeah.
such as it is wrong to kill innocent human beings for no reason. Okay? No human being cannot not know that. I mean, everyone knows that. That is one thing that we cannot not know. It's just everybody knows it. All cultures, all places. And there are several examples of these basic things that you would get no disagreement on. So how do we know that this moral law exists? What is the evidence for an objective moral law? Well, the first thing is that the moral law is undeniable. We looked at relativism, and I'm going to tell you that the two things that relativists, and a relativist is somebody who does not believe in objective truth or objective morality. What they'll say is it all depends on taste and opinion, and it's all a part of the cultural mores, but there isn't something that exists outside of these cultures that tell them what is right and wrong. That just simply doesn't exist. That's what a relativist is. And we looked at the two main claims that a relativist uses. Number one is there's no absolute truth. And if you remember from our truth talk, that is simply self-defeating. Okay? If somebody says there is no absolute truth, you ask them, well, are you absolutely sure about that? And the answer is if they say yes, they are defeating their argument by being absolutely sure that there's no absolute truth. It is a self-defeating statement. Okay? And that's not a trick. That's a real thing, and it's based on the law of non-contradiction that we talked about. That something can't be A and not A at the same time. And that's exactly what happens when you say there is no absolute truth. We're saying no absolute truth, but the statement there is no absolute truth is an absolute truth. Okay? It can't be A and not A both at the same time. It falls apart. It is nonsense. Okay? So the relativist falls apart on absolute truth. Now, unfortunately, there are no absolute moral values is not a self-defeating statement, but it is undeniable. What that means is in trying to deny the moral values, he's actually putting moral value on his denial. And he's expecting to be valued as a person, and he's expecting you to consider and value his statement and his opinion. Okay? You see, there's a fuzzy thought. You know, there's a fuzzy thought in there to say, well, there's no absolute value. There's no absolute moral value. But I'm going to demand that you have respect and value for what I have to say. I have a right to say this. I have a right to my opinion. But there's no objective moral values or right, which means that I really don't have a value or right to that opinion. Okay? So what they're saying is in denying it, in trying to deny it, they're actually affirming that there is an objective moral value, that I have value as a person, which makes it worth me up here saying something about my opinion. Do you follow what I'm saying? It is practically undeniable. I'm gonna do this now. This is not mine. This is a true story, and this is an exchange that occurred between a guy by the name of Norman Geisler and somebody that was in an audience that he was speaking to. And I've kind of distilled it down and paraphrased it, but I think it illustrates what I'm trying to say about this, and it illustrates it well. I want you to just consider this exchange. I am up here and I make this comment, and I'm talking about objective morality, and I say, there are such things as objective moral values to which we all have an obligation. To which somebody in the audience stands up, raises their hand, puts their hands on their hips, and says, and they say, there are no real values. It's only a matter of taste or opinion. To which I could reply, all right, well then sit down, shut up, you ignorant egghead. Who wants to hear your opinion anyway? Okay. Now, it would be wrong for me to be rude and insulting and dismissive like that. Okay? Do you see what's happening here? It would be wrong, implying that there's a right way to behave in this. So she would then complain, go to the organizers of the conference. He said, that man was so rude. He shut me down. He told me to shut up. He insulted me. And he did not acknowledge my right to get up and object with him. And by that very complaint, what she is saying is that I have a moral right to stand up and express my opinion. I have value as a person to be heard. But yet it's her very own argument that says that that doesn't exist, giving me the right to be rude and mean to her. Now, I don't believe that it's right to be mean or rude, but only by her system of thinking that there's no values or morals does it make it okay and right and acceptable for me to be angry, rude, mean, and dismissive. Do you follow how her complaining about it actually recognizes that there is a right way to behave, that there is an objective moral value? Her very complaint about my behavior. Do you follow that? Okay.
Do you thank her for making his point?
No, well, he wasn't rude and angry to her, so that was a hypothetical with respect to the complaint. So, in complaining about my response, she affirms my initial point and proves herself wrong. That those that deny all values nevertheless value their right to deny it. Okay? Number two on this is we know right from wrong best by our reactions, not our actions. Look, the reality is we have all done something wrong. we have all broken this moral law. We've all, at one time or another, perhaps had little white lie or embellishments, or have done things that, well, quite frankly, we know are wrong. And so this law is not known by the way that we behave, but it is known very clearly by how we react when people are unjust to us, because our reactions will belie what we believe. So I want to tell another little vignette to make this clear. A professor at an Indiana school assigned a term paper. And the term paper was in an ethics class, and he said, you can write on any ethical subject that you want to. Totally up to you. But it's got to be of a particular length, and you've got to have it handed in at this particular time, and you've got to have reasoning and reasons for defending your point of view, and you have to have documentation of your research in this. Okay? So reasons and documentation. So an atheist in this class wrote on moral relativism, what we're talking about here. And the essence of his paper was this, that all morals are relative, that there are no absolute standards of justice or rightness, that it's all a matter of taste and opinion, kind of like you like chocolate and I like vanilla. And in his paper, he provides reasons and documentation. So he got his paper, and it was the right length, and it was turned in on time, and it was very stylishly presented in this beautiful blue folder. And he handed it in to the professor, and the professor took all the papers, he read them, and he graded them. So after reading his paper, he takes it on the front, and he writes a big fat F. And he says, I don't like blue. I don't like blue folders. So the student gets his paper back, and he is enraged. And he comes stomping in to that professor's office, and he says, an F? You don't like blue? What? That's not fair. That's not right. What are you talking about? There's nothing just about that. You didn't grade this on the merits of my paper. And the professor says, no, wait a minute. Wasn't your paper that one? I mean, I read a lot of papers, but wasn't it the one that argued that there's no fairness, there's no rightness, and there's no justice? That, you know, you like chocolate, I like vanilla. He says, yeah, that's my paper. He's like, well, I don't like blue. You get an F. And I think in that moment, the guy realized, the student realized, that in his response to how the professor graded his paper on the preference of a color was neither right, nor fair, nor just, and the entire premise of his entire paper was destroyed by his reaction when he felt it was unjust or not right to grade my paper as an F without considering the merits of the paper as opposed to just considering my opinion about superficial things. Okay? In other words, he realized that he was wrong, that the whole premise of his paper was wrong, and you know it by your reaction when injustice occurs to you. It is our reaction that says, there really is justice out there. There's just and unjust. There really is a right way to do things and a wrong way. There's right and there is wrong. That there really is fair and unfair. And all you have to do is look at our reactions. To kind of sum it up, to be honest with you, if you find somebody that denies objective morality, if you wanted them to figure out really quickly that they don't believe that, steal their car. And by their very reactions, they will deny that there's no objective morality about whether it's right or wrong to steal their car.
Not really.
Some would say that Osama bin Laden felt morally right in his actions on September 11th. And that that what he did was justified. And it's hard to get into the mind of a guy like this. I'm going to go back one here. We don't need to look at Holocaust pictures quite yet. Well, I can't. All right. But here's the thing. If you ask the question, so here's what Osama bin Laden did. He took United States planes. He flew them into United States buildings, and he killed our loved ones and innocents that had nothing to do with the conflict in the Middle East. And for anybody that talks about that bin Laden may have felt that he was morally right in doing this, or that he was provoked to action, if we simply use the exact same scenario and say, how would Al-Qaeda, how would Osama bin Laden feel about Americans taking Middle Eastern planes, flying them into Al-Qaeda buildings, and killing the people that they love and who are innocent in this conflict? I mean, there would be moral outrage. There would be moral outrage. Of course, this is wrong. The point is that to sometimes see what's right and wrong, we have to go by our reactions to things rather than our actions in how we live our life.
That may be why the golden rule is so powerful. Because it turns your own actions against yourself so that you can feel the results of what you yourself are doing.
So what we're doing now is we're going along and we're saying, what is the evidence for an objective moral law? And issue number one is that there is the objective moral law is practically undeniable. Number two, we can identify it through our reactions rather than our actions. And without the moral law, there's no way that you could know justice or injustice. It allows us to identify it. A common argument against God is what I always call the problem of evil. The presence of evil in the world, the problem of evil is something like this: is if God is good and God is just and God is all powerful, then how do we explain why bad things happen to good people? And in fact, an atheist will use this problem, and Terry can attest, if you go on to atheist websites, there's actually not a whole lot of science and logic going on there. There's a whole lot of rage and hatred. And most of that rage and hatred has to do with the evil that's in the world. Okay? If you really boil it down to brass tacks, that's where it's at. So this is a huge problem. And I'm not going to go into it. We may go into it later in the course as kind of an aside. But the atheist will assert that it's more logical to believe that God does not exist than to explain how evil and God could possibly coexist. Okay? Basically, the argument is, well, if God is all powerful and God is all good, yet this is a world that He made and there's so much evil and pain in it, then either God's not all powerful because He can't make it good, or He's not all good because He has allowed all this evil to exist. Okay, so they would say it's better to believe in no God at all than it is to try to understand how evil and God could coexist. Okay, because of problems with His power or His goodness. And again, that's a whole other topic. We've spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks exploring that. But I just want to put that's the problem of evil. But in reality, C.S. Lewis was an atheist before he became a very powerful Christian apologist and writer. And he believed that the cruelty and injustice in the world confirmed his atheism. But he began to think about that. He is a brilliant mind and an excellent philosopher, and quite frankly, he was an honest philosopher. He didn't have a presupposition that he always channeled his thoughts into, and he came to this realization one day that has to do with our topic right now. How do you know justice from injustice? And what he realized is, how did C.S. Lewis know that the world was unjust? How did he know it was cruel and evil? And what he said was, a man doesn't he can't call a line crooked unless he knows or has some idea of what a straight line is. To what was I comparing this universe to when I called it unjust? And it was actually this realization that led C.S. Lewis out of atheism and eventually into Christianity. So, we saw the slide on the Holocaust. And we could ask a Jewish person about their thoughts on the Holocaust. But what is interesting is, how does a Jewish atheist respond to the Holocaust? And in a debate against a Jewish atheist, one of the people that wrote this book, a guy by the name of Norm Geisler, he asked him that question. And he responded honestly, and he responded with something that was consistent with his atheism. And this is what he said. He said, on what basis do you say the Holocaust was wrong? And he said, by my own benign moral feeling. Now, if we think about that for just a moment, that is truly akin to saying, I like vanilla and not chocolate. By my own opinion, which is meaningless outside of myself. And so what he was saying is that the Holocaust is reduced to just a personal opinion about its goodness or badness, rightness or wrongness. In other words, what I'm trying to point out to you is, in a world without God, there is no just and unjust. There is only my opinion about whether something's good or bad, right or wrong. It is reduced to a personal preference. And we can't look at the Holocaust and call it evil, call it unjust, call it bad. It is just a matter of my personal opinion, like vanilla or chocolate, if there is no God.
It's kind of like if you're in outer space, there's no up and down. The only way you know what down is because the planet Earth has gravity, and it holds you down.
Yeah,
You need something external to you to tell you what's down and what's up. If you're just out there floating in space, there isn't any up or down. You're just floating.
That's true.
And I think morally, that's what a lot of atheists do, is they're just floating in moral outer space. You know, and they might see themselves heading in a certain direction and just arbitrarily say, well, that's down, because that's the way I'm going. But in reality, unless you've got a planet with gravity that's anchoring you down, you really don't. You can't say this is down and this is up. You need that gravity to hold you. So I think God is kind of like that gravity for us. He gives us an anchor so we can say this is down and that's up.
And earlier, what you're talking about, and I apologize, I don't want to open this up because you said you maybe get to it later on, but talking about allowing bad in the world, or evil and the existence of that with God. It kind of speaks to, I think, what you talked about earlier, how you can't have this and that. It's going to be, one or the other. In terms of, God didn't want the robotic worship of the masses. He gave us free will, he gave us choice, but he can't tell you that you're going to be good and say he's giving you free will at the same time, or free choice.
Exactly. You can't predetermine your choice.
Yeah, exactly. And I've always that's always come naturally to me, because I've always thought in terms of my wife. I wouldn't be real thrilled if my wife married me because she thought she had to.
Well, what that boils down to is and we'll just take a little left turn for just a moment, again, because I could spend weeks talking about the problem of evil. But the thumbnail sketch of it boils down to this: that the essence of God is love. And love is not expressed in forced relationships. Love is expressed in a two-way, freely submissive relationship to the partner in whom you have this relationship. So because God's very nature is love, then his relationship with us is in a loving relationship. And love is not coerced. Coerced love is rape. Okay? God is not a God of rape. God is a God of free, two-way, submissive love. And because of that, you have to have free will, because it is not a submissive love unless you have the ability to reject it. Okay? And so with that ability to reject God comes the power to introduce evil into the world. Okay? That is the 30-second response to the problem of evil. But it's way deeper and more profound than that. And we could talk a long time.
Because
So,
God is all good, and so any time you reject God,
Right,
you're
right.
rejecting good.
Exactly. Okay. So here's the bottom line. Here's the point of this particular section, where we're talking about without the moral law, we would not be able to differentiate justice from injustice. Is that if there's no moral law, then we would not be able to detect evil or injustice of any kind, including something as profoundly evil as the Holocaust. Without God, it is merely reduced down to a personal opinion or preference on what it means. If we were to say that there is something outside of us that says that that was really evil and wrong, then that means that there is something more than our opinion of whether it was wrong. So, next is, without the moral law, we could not measure moral difference. So how do we compare Mother Teresa from Adolf Hitler without an objective moral law? Well, the answer is something that Terry was getting at with her illustration of gravity. Here are two maps of Scotland, Map A and Map B. Now, the question is, which of these reflects a truer reflection? Which is a more accurate reflection of Scotland? Well, the only way to know that would be to put up a picture of the true, real, unchanging Scotland. So if we do that, we could look at that and say, well, that is what Scotland really looks like. So we would say that Map A is a closer representation to the true Scotland than Map B. Well, when comparing Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler, we do the same thing. That's like the gravity. We know what up and down is because of gravity. And so when we look at Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler, it is the moral law. It is God's unchanging moral nature that is the standard of the measurement. So you can see which one looks closer by comparing it to the actual. What are we comparing it to? God's unchanging moral nature. So we appeal to this unchanging standard outside of both of them, which is what we call the moral law. But if the moral law doesn't exist, then there is no moral difference between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler. Now we know that there is a difference. That is the evidence for the moral law. And to take it one step further is, if there is no objective standard of measurement by which we can compare a Mother Teresa with an Adolf Hitler, what that means is that statements like murder is evil, or racism is wrong, or you shouldn't abuse children, they all have no objective meaning, because there's no standard by which we judge those statements. Basically, if this doesn't exist, anything goes. And to believe in moral relativism is to argue that there's really no moral difference between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler. To believe in moral relativism says that there's really no moral difference between freedom and slavery. to believe in moral relativism is to argue that there's no real moral difference between equality and racism, or care and abuse, or love and hate, or life and murder. And, you know, we look at this moral relativism, and all it is kind of a line in the sand between the bad guy and the good guy. But where do we put that line? I mean, this is kind of what we like to do. This is why moral relativism is so appealing. Okay, well, we'll all acknowledge that Mother Teresa is kind of better than we are. She's, you know, this woman who has committed her life to taking care of the poor and oppressed in the gutters of India. And then you've got a guy like this, like Adolf Hitler, way down here. And then maybe a little bit higher than Adolf Hitler are the criminals that we deal with in the world. And then maybe a little bit better than the criminals are the immoral, the people that are doing wicked, evil things, but maybe aren't caught. And then maybe we'd put our picture over here on the other side of the line somewhere. And then Mother Teresa a little bit ahead of us. And then we kind of draw that line in the sand, and then we say, well, those guys, as long as they're lower than me, those are the ones going to hell. And, well, the ones that are on the other side of the line, those are the ones going to heaven. But really, if there's a true objective law, and I took this slide out, I shouldn't have, but it's one that is measured way above us and is only measured in Christ. And that is what is meant by, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. What we are saying with that is a moral law exists, and none of us have met that moral law. None of us have met that. And it's the whole reason and purpose for God's redemptive plan. It is not a relative thing that is based on culture, because that's no real line at all. That eliminates the distinctions between love and hate, between right and wrong, between, you know, caring for people and raping them. Okay, there's no moral difference between them. So we know it, but we deny it. It seems then that we are forced to believe in a real right and wrong. First, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. Second, they do not in fact behave in that way. The truth is, we believe in decency so much that we can't bear to face the fact that we are breaking it, and consequently, we try to shift the responsibility. What C.S. Lewis is arguing here is he's saying, when we do what's wrong, we know it, and we try to shift the blame. It's not my fault. Okay? It's my mother made me do it.
Never made me do it.
It's the way I was raised. It's because those people are so mean and evil, and I just couldn't help myself. You know, I had to haul off and whack them. You know, there's just all kinds of things. Nobody says, well, you know, I'm a good person because I'm going out and doing whatever the heck it is I please to do. I'm letting all of my, there's no difference. So I have sex with whom I want. I beat up whom I want because I'm big and strong. I have all these things that I want to do it. I do it, and I'm a good person for that. I mean, nobody does that. Nobody says that. And what we do is we try to deny the wrong that we do. We try to excuse the wrong we do. And the point is that that's another evidence that we really know. We really know that there's an objective right and an objective wrong. Because when we do wrong, we try to excuse it. And I'd like to consider also that if without moral law, there would be no human rights. There would be no concept of what human rights are. There would be no rights at all. It's just the strong does whatever they want to, and there's no immorality in that if there is no objective law. I want to consider, like, again, the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to skip this here. I'm going to skip this couple of things here. Rats. I've got it in the wrong spot. You'll have to forgive me. So, the Declaration of Independence, we go back to that, and after we talk about the inalienable rights, that we were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the next line says this, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In other words, governments are instituted for the purpose of securing the God-given rights. Okay? The purpose of government is not to give rights. The purpose of government is not to take away rights. Government has no power to give or take away rights. These are given by the moral law, and the purpose of governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. Why? To secure those rights that are given by God. That is the purpose of our government. And so, the point here is that our human rights are something that are part of the natural law, something that's a part of the moral law, something that is endowed on us by our Creator. And so, without that moral law, there would be no notion of human rights. It's the same exact thing that we use at Nuremberg in the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Where do we get our notion that there were atrocities by the Germans, by the Nazi regime? Without moral law, there is no human rights. There is no basis on which we could try the Nazi regime for these crimes. There is no crime if there are no human rights. And so, finally, I want to go over things that we're not saying and things that we are saying. We are not saying here that atheists can't be moral. They can. We are not saying that atheists don't know morality. They, in fact, do. What we are saying is that atheists can't justify morality. They have no basis on which they can justify any of a cause that they may have. They can theorize about how we know murder is wrong, but atheism provides no immaterial objective standard that establishes why murder is wrong. No worries. If we are to say that there is a real right and wrong, an immaterial objective standard of justice requires a theistic God. And we are not saying, we agree with atheists that some atheists lead better moral lives than some Christians. And that some who say that they're church people have poisoned the teachings of Christ, and that church history is filled with what's often been immoral, unjust, and even overtly evil actions. And we agree. And we're only saying here, though, that there is no moral or immoral, just or unjust, good or evil, unless God exists. Okay? So there's no comments about whether atheists can be good people. What we're saying is they can't justify their goodness.
Can't define it.
They can't define it. That's right. So what we are left with now is we have gone through 3 arguments for a theistic God. We have talked about the cosmological argument, which says that, as we said at the beginning of class, everything that begins has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. The teleologic, which is basically every design has a designer. The universe and life is filled with intricate design. Therefore, the universe and life have a designer. And finally, the moral argument, which is every law has a lawgiver. There is an objective moral law, which is what the case that I presented to you today. And therefore, there is an objective moral lawgiver. So what we have established in our 7 or 8 weeks now is this, that from the cosmological argument, that the first cause is immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. We know that because before anything existed, there was nothing. Therefore, what was able to cause it could not be inside of nature. It had to be outside of time, outside of space, outside of substance, material world, to be able to make all of that come into existence. Time itself, all matter in space from nothing. That means he had to be outside of it to be able to bring it into existence. So that the first cause is immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. And that he is extremely powerful because he made and created something from nothing. And from the teleological design, the argument from design, that he is extremely intelligent, holding the entire universe together in this beautiful orchestra that is all geared towards life on earth. And also the immense design in life itself that we spent weeks going over. And that he has purpose. There is purpose in this design. And finally, that he is the bar and the standard of the moral law, that he is absolutely morally perfect and is personal. That's very relevant for the discussion that we had about the problem of evil in the world. And I would like to point out that this is an awful lot like the God of biblical Christianity. And the identification of the characteristics of God has been completely identified without a single reference to the Bible. And so we are going to close out with this here, and we are done with this section. Where we're going to go from here is to say now, and I got to skip over, I put back the Declaration of Independence because I wanted to compare it to the Nuremberg trials and our moral authority for why we separated from England. Had to do with the exact same thing. It had to do with human rights, just like the Nuremberg trials, but I put it in the wrong spot. And so where we're at right now is the possibilities in a theistic universe that could be true. What we're left with is that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all possibilities. These are all theistic religions. But what we've done now between the cosmological argument, the teleologic argument, and the moral argument is what cannot be true are Hinduism, Buddhism, New Age, secular humanism, Mormonism, polytheism, Wicca, Confucianism, Taoism. These are not consistent with a creator God. They're not consistent with a designer God. They're not consistent with the moral God. What is consistent for our world is what we call a theistic. God made all. Okay, that is the only type of faith that is consistent. And so where we're going to go from here is ask the question, so which is true? Judaism, Christianity, or Islam? And we're going to start next week with miracles. And are miracles possible? And then from miracles, we're going to look at the New Testament. And we're going to ask, is the New Testament true? And we're going to look at the evidence of the truth of the New Testament to answer the question, in a theistic universe, what's true? Okay? So that's the end of our...